Um, so if the bureaucracy is not elected, they're either appointed by the president or they're going to be hired, and they're going to use what's called the civil service system. Now, the civil service system replaced what was known as either the patronage system or the spoils system. Anybody know what that stuff is? Jackson is a great example. Can you tell me what Andrew Jackson did?
He's like, I'm going to give all the stuff to my friend.
I don't think he actually had that voice. But sounds more like Colonel Sanders, but okay. But right, so the patronage system is the idea of giving jobs, political jobs, to people who supported you in politics. So they voted for you, they helped campaign for you, they gave you some money as a donation, and now that you're in power, you give them a job. Which sounds like it's all bad. Why? Why does that sound so bad? Jackson. Yeah, corrupt, and like your best friend is fairly unlikely to be an expert in whatever kind of policy area you choose to hire them for, or whatever. But then I read this interesting article, I don't know, a few months ago, and the thesis of the article was basically that the civil service system is part of the reason that we have so much corruption in politics today. Because like under the civil service system, then yeah, it was a little bit corrupt, but it was like corrupt in the sense that like elected officials were ingratiating themselves with the public by offering jobs. But that when we took that away, then now the like elected officials can't really buy people's loyalty anymore, and so now the public officials don't really have the power to like organize groups. Who does? Well, wealthy interest groups, right? And so that the idea now being that, well, who does the rewarding, who controls, who pulls the strings? Well, it used to be the politicians, and at least the politicians themselves were elected, you know, like if they did a terrible job appointing people we didn't like we could vote them out of office. But now the argument of the paper was that we've opened up influence for other forms of corruption because we've taken away this like example. Anyway, I'm not sure I'm totally sold, because it still seems pretty bad of an idea for me to like appoint people who are completely unqualified for a position. But it's interesting to think about. So, okay, so the civil service system replaces patronage or the spoil system, and the law that started all of that was the Pendleton Civil Service Act. You'll want to know, you'll be able to articulate, it was the Pendleton Act. Okay? The Pendleton Civil Service Act. Okay, so what else, what other parts of your definition did you have for me? Who has another definition? Alphabet soup. Okay, so there's, if I can phrase that, maybe lots of organizations. I'm going to add to that the idea of hierarchy. We know that the bureaucracy is organized in a very hierarchical way. There are people in charge of whole departments, and then there are organizations within the departments who then have people in charge of them, and so on. What else did you come up with part of your definition? Yes? Okay, so they are actually executing the policies. And I'm going to add to that the idea of specialization. Several times I'm going to talk about the same sort of example, which I feel a little bit bad talking about because I feel like I hope that it will always be fiction. Let's pretend that Dorothy had heaven forbid, had some sort of terrible, rare, like so far uncurable disease, right? Well, who's in charge of experimental treatments? The FDA, right? So the FDA is in charge of experimental treatments, and let's say that there is a chemical compound that is being researched in mice or researched in whatever that might help Dorothy. She has this terrible disease. Her doctor says she'll only have a few months to live. She's miserable. My heart is broken. And I find out somehow, because you will never know what a desperate mother can find, I find out that this research is going on. And I beg them, please give me a dose for my daughter. And they refuse. Well, as an angry, heartbroken mom, I'm going to be really upset about that, right? But on the other hand, no matter how many people I convince to be angry and heartbroken with me, who probably really knows best? The FDA, right? Because especially if it's in really, really early stages of experimentation, they have no idea if it will cause worse side effects, like it might make my daughter even more miserable than she would already have been. They have no idea of knowing if it's safe. Are there other like consequences? Might exposure to the substance like affect the quality of life in my home overall? They have no idea of knowing what those kinds of long-term effects would be, and it is safer until they can determine that it won't hurt anybody worse. Then they really don't want that to be a substance that then becomes out in the public. It might throw off their own trials, might make it impossible to eventually develop into a drug, whatever it is. They probably know best. So this idea of specialization is going to be important because we need the people who are running the so-called minutia of government, we need them to know what they're doing as part of that process. Anything else, your definitions for bureaucracy? Yeah, they definitely are going. This comes to this idea of specialization. It does, like, why do we have a bureaucracy? Because it would be very difficult for the president to do it all, right? The president can't actually be at every single, Social Security office taking in your application or your information. They need to be able to hire people to do all those things and to sort of run the day-to-day aspects. Yeah, absolutely. Anything else? Well, do any of you get warm, fuzzy feelings when you hear the word bureaucracy? You just wish that you could cuddle up next to the bureaucracy or spend a whole day with the bureaucracy. You can, you just maybe don't want to. Right, I mean the DMV is everybody's like vision of the bureaucracy, right? 7,000 forms, and you fill out one of them, just one letter wrong, and then they send you home for another 6-hour wait the next day, or people who clearly are fulfilled in their line of work and ready to share their joy with you as you come to experience their role in government.
6 hours at a time.
So, kind of grouchy people. Do they tend to move super fast and efficiently? Not so much. Tends to be a little bit slower maybe than we expect. There's a whole article. Maybe it's extra credit. I really should know more. This is what happens when I plan in the summer. But there is an article that I at least thought about making a mini quiz, and maybe I did make it the extra credit one. That there's this big thesis that was written about why isn't the bureaucracy more like McDonald's? The argument being that both low-level bureaucrats, like DMV workers or postal workers, and McDonald's employees make about the same amount of money. So why is it McDonald's is all about customer satisfaction and efficiency, and they're really quick about it, and they make sure that everything's clean, and they whatever, and then the DMV allows you to wait 6,000 hours only to be yelled at and turned away for something that was not even your fault. Not that I've experienced that personally at all. Right, so there are lots of sort of elements to the idea of bureaucracy being a bad thing, but I'd like you to take a moment at your tables and can you brainstorm together one or two things that you are you're just feeling really happy about the government. For example, I am really pleased that I brushed my teeth this morning and had no fear that the chemicals in my toothbrush or in my toothpaste would kill me. Thanks FDA. I am not worried about my household products. If you're one of those supernatural people who was were there insert name of ingredient here in your toothpaste, because maybe you should be worried. Don't tell me, actually. But talk at your tables about what it is that you are really pleased about from the government. Go.
I haven't been shot yet.
I'm pleased about that, too.
I'm very happy that I was got a point.
All right, anybody ready to share? What are you pleased about? I heard someone say school. You might be making it up, but I'm pleased that you're pleased to be in school. Look at this wonderful thing the government has provided to you. No, probably not. But anyway, yeah, sure. What else? Yes? Yeah, the fact that roads exist and are built publicly. I mean, if there were no, public roads, and we have to rely on rich people or businesses to build roads where they wanted there to be roads, and otherwise we'd all have to sort of struggle along those 18th century potholes where people literally drowned. What else? You what? Yeah, you can send letters, real actual letters, for a much lower price than you would probably have to pay if we only had private organizations. What else? Nobody? That's literally all you've got? Good. Yeah, yay! Vaccinations and all of that. Well, so Win for America. Right, so when we consider all of that, we've got to know that all of those good things that we think, like, yay, government, I'm pleased that if an employer is so sort of callously unconcerned about human life that they have these crazy dangerous working conditions, that there are federal offices where I can complain and seek somebody to come and help make working conditions safer. I'm glad that there's no child labor. I'm glad that there's police protection. I'm glad that we have secure borders than we would have if we didn't have the government in charge. Like, all of those things the government does are functions of the bureaucracy. So we can talk about the moaning and groaning and how frustrating the bureaucracy is and how they don't do anything right and they waste taxpayer dollars and they're inefficient and they're redundant, and maybe some of those things are true. For sure, some of those things are true. And it's hard to imagine in many cases how we might do better. The end of that article that I told you about comparing the DMV to McDonald's basically concluded that there are so many other factors that are at stake in public administration, that the kinds of, for example, profit and incentives, or the kinds of actions like firing workers who aren't doing the right thing, that we don't want them in politics or in government, because it would lead to the potential for either corruption, which is a huge thing we need to try to avoid in government, or would lead to the potential for abuse of the system, so that we sacrifice some of those more capitalistic things like time and cheerfulness and hamburgers, I don't know, in favor of the sort of loftier goals. So, okay, so here's a look. This is a 2010 list, which was the last time one was compiled that I could find, which concerns me for other reasons. But this is just a partial list. It was longer than this. This is all the ones I'd ever heard of before in my life. There was a whole bunch of others that I'd never actually heard of. Of the organizations responsible in some way for border security. So there's Customs and Border Protection, the U.S. Border Patrol and Customs Service. Under the Department of Agriculture, that's the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. That's a very particular job. Department of State has the Passport Office. The DOJ has ATF, the DEA, the FBI, and INS. Health and Human Services has the FDA and the CDC. The Department of Transportation has the FAA. Homeland Security has ICE, the Coast Guard, and the TSA. And the Treasury has the Customs Service. Anyone see any problems with that? Yeah, maybe too many cooks in the kitchen. Who's in charge? Why are those things problems? Okay, well, why? Okay, it's hard to move forward in any one direction when you've got all of these different organizations that are going to make their own decisions. What else? Yeah, absolutely. So, a single shipment of, I don't know, fruits and vegetables or something is going to come under the Department of Agriculture's Plant Health and Inspection Service, and then maybe the FDA if it's processed food, and if they are flown in, I think I said truck, but let's change the story and say they're flown in, well then the FAA has something to say. Like, you can see, Atlanta's right. There's definitely going to be a lot of places where there's overlap. And overlap would be bad because, yeah, it's inefficient. It's redundant. We're talking about taxpayer dollars. If we're paying 4 different agencies to do something that maybe just one could do, that seems challenging. On the other hand, I would venture to suggest to you that, okay, let's say we could combine 4 of these agencies. Well, is this all they do, border security? No, they also do other things. So, sure, we could create a new agency like the Department of Border Security, and we could give them all of these jobs by itself, but then we would have just created a new agency, because the old ones would still exist, because they would still need to do all the other jobs that they're involved in, right? And then there's the idea of, we'll just get fewer agencies involved, reduce the amount of agencies that are given jurisdiction in this area. But for example, I looked at this list, and at first I go, the CDC? What does that have to do with border? But then you think about it for approximately 5 seconds longer, and you go, well, if there's an international health pandemic, then we want the CDC to be involved in helping us decide what our new border security policies are going to be, or designing new kinds of screenings for people crossing the border. So expertise in each of these small areas is pretty important to have. We had similar problems kind of come up in the aftermath of September the 11th, 2001. So the 9/11 Commission, which was put together by Congress to figure out what went wrong, how could we have been taken by surprise. And one of their biggest conclusions was that we actually had pretty good intelligence in tiny fragmentary pieces across the board, but two problems occurred. First of all, let's say I'm a genius intelligence analyst. I find this piece of information, a credible threat. I understand this is important. I pass it on to my boss because, remember, bureaucracies are hierarchical. I have to follow the chain of command. I give it to my boss. My boss thinks it's so important that I must have sent it directly to the director. So my boss just doesn't send it on themselves. So then the information gets lost. Or I have a piece of information that I think is pretty important, but definitely not urgent. So I just put it in a regular file. But if I had known that somewhere in the NSA, somebody had a similar piece of fragmentary, fairly important information, but definitely not urgent, and then somewhere in the FBI or the CIA, again, additional information, if I knew all of those pieces of the puzzle, I might have been able to realize that what I had was, in fact, not just important, but the end of the world urgent. We have to act on this right now immediately, right? And so that was one of the things that prompted a reorganization of our intelligence system after 9/11, trying to reduce some of those problems. But it's impossible to do, because we still need to have the FBI focus primarily on domestic stuff, and then we still have to have the CIA focusing primarily on international threats, and we still have to have the NSA focusing primarily on, you know, the electronic stuff, and they don't all have the same focus. How can they perfectly share information? If the NSA gave the FBI everything they had every single day, nobody ever would be able to sort through it. So then it's identifying better channels for sharing information and what kinds of pools we can put them in. So again, this is not a clear cut, like, the bureaucracy is insert adjective here kind of lecture, but more like understanding kind of the complexities of how the bureaucracy works. We've done all this. This is just a graph. Basically, when we talked about Congress, we talked about how the Congress is not particularly representative. What does that mean? Doesn't mean they don't do a good job doing what we want. What does it mean to say that Congress is not representative? Yeah, they don't reflect what the country looks like. They're way too old, male, and white. The bureaucracy still is reasonably unrepresentative, but is better, right? So this is kind of old data. I couldn't find a pretty way to show the new data to you. But the gender ratio is almost even now. So it's like 52% male and 48% female, which is certainly better than Congress. The racial ratio is even better now, something like 51 or 2% white, and 40 some odd percent total of other ethnicities and races. So definitely doing better than Congress. Can you think of why that might be good? Well, they have a lot of power and they're not elected. So it's good that they at the very least tend to represent the kinds of ideas that the regular people might have. Okay, so on your note sheet there is a little like paragraph section about careerists, politicians, and professionals. I'm not going to go over that. It's not like you need to know it in a huge amount. Oh, did I just turn it off? That is very sad. We'll see how fast it comes back on. But I will say that you might consider, like, careerists are people like my friend. I have a friend who works for the Census Bureau. I might have talked about her to you before. And she was a little bit concerned because you might have heard, like, so it made the news when President Trump's transition team asked the Department of Energy to give them the names and information of anybody who had been to a climate change conference. And the Department of Energy, it made news because the Department of Energy refused to do so. They said that was, like, scary. Why would he want that information? Of course, we don't know what he would have done with it either way. And in 4 days, he's going to be in charge. He won't have to ask for the information. He'll, like, own the information. So there's that. But so my friend worked for the Census Bureau, and she was a little bit concerned because the Census Bureau was also asked to share information about researchers in various areas. And she has 2 years ago just completed a project on the effects of the Affordable Care Act on demographic characteristics in the country, life expectancy and general health and age mortality, all this kind of stuff. And her report concluded favorably that the Affordable Care Act had improved many of those measures. And so her name was reported to the Trump transition team about, like, this area. And her speculation was that the worst that would happen is she'd be told to cease and desist her research. Like, for example, the CDC is forbidden from researching information about gun death. right? That's like a law has been passed so that no U.S. federal dollars can be spent on researching gun control, basically. Anyway, so she was basically saying that the worst thing could happen. They can't fire her. There's the Pendleton Civil Service Act, unless she actually does something wrong. She can't just be fired. But that they would try to stop or infringe upon her work. And so that's where the point of the story, getting back to the idea of careerist versus politician. Let's say that President Trump's appointee to lead the Census Bureau tries to tell everyone, you're going to stop researching these other things. I want you to do this instead. I want you to focus your efforts on this. I want you to find control populations that will help us approve this thing, whatever they say. Well, how long is that Trump appointee going to be there? A maximum of 8 years. And my friend, this is her career. She plans to be there at least 30 more years before she retires. Does she have any incentive at all to comply with those requests? I mean, she needs to comply enough to not get fired, right? She can't be insubordinate and get enough letters on her file that she could be fired. But other than that, she can drag her feet a lot, And there's not a lot that those politicians in the bureaucracy can really do about it, because their political tenure in the bureaucracy is short. 4 or 8 years max. But for the people who are hired in the bureaucracy, they have a nice long tenure, can literally be their whole lives. The bureaucracy, there's an interesting study done about for social mobility, if you are poor and you want to not be poor, you want to become middle class, you want to raise your children middle class, what are the best jobs to pursue? The U.S. Post Office was listed in the top 10. And the idea being that you can get an entry-level job for the U.S. Post Office with very little skills. You don't even need a college degree. Just a high school diploma would be enough. But that pays federal benefits, federal job protections, federal training opportunities. Wages aren't awesome, but aren't terrible either. And there are opportunities for internal advancement through programs like qualifying for leadership positions. So again, people make careers out of the bureaucracy, and it's very difficult for politicians to change that. Like President Obama. Anybody heard anything good about the VA recently? Not very much, right? There's a lot of negative stuff about the VA and how ineffective it might be, or how long the wait is, or veterans who served our country dying, waiting for medical care, whatever it is. Well, President Obama campaigned on promises, I'm going to reform the VA, I'm going to fix things, I'm going to make it better. Well, he hasn't really made it very much better. And maybe it's because President Obama's ideas were terrible and he picked bad leaders. That's entirely possible. On the other hand, it's also entirely possible that the reforms have been resisted, that people who are actually on the ground working on patient intake or designing the forms or organizing the systems simply choose not to do them. And it's very difficult for us to force that. Anyway, okay. So on the screen, these are the symbols or the seals for the 15 cabinet level agencies. We're on to our chart now, the big box thing. And so of these 15 cabinet level offices, you should know 2 or 3 with some examples. So you can pick your favorites. I like the Department of Justice. They're in charge of the FBI, is a good example. The Department of Labor presides over the National Labor Relations Board. Yes? The CIA is an independent agency, so they're not under a cabinet level office. We'll talk about what that means in a little while. That's 3 or 4 more down the list. The Department of the Treasury, which oversees the Secret Service, which I always thought was interesting. But the Secret Service is also in charge of counterfeit stuff. Fun story from when I was a little girl, while you're writing down your examples of your agencies here. My parents and I went to this hotel. I don't remember where we were. San Antonio, maybe? And we went, and my sister laid backwards over the bed, sideways, her head was dangling, and she was looking up at the lamp, and she's like, oh, there's some paper under here, under the lamp, and she pulled out a piece of paper, and it was a $100 bill. And she was like, oh, there's more, and she keeps pulling, and there's a stack of 8 or 10 $100 bills, and my dad was like, wow, we should report this, you take it to the front desk or whatever, and then he looked at them, and they had identical serial numbers. And so then, he had to call the Secret Service agent came and visited my family, and it wasn't the President's Secret Service, but somebody from the Secret Service to talk about, basically just took down the story, and they've followed up with, currency manipulation or whatever. Okay, all right, so what is the job of the cabinet? That first column, it says details of the job. For example, what is the job of the Department of Transportation? Okay, so they're overseeing, they're like road construction, they're overseeing, don't write that, I mean, this is cabinet level, so don't write build roads, that is not true of all cabinet offices. They're overseeing building roads, they're overseeing, so Department of Transportation has like the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, so like air traffic and maintaining safety and establishing policies and all this business. So we can more broadly say that their job is to like organize and enact policy in the area of transportation. And if it's the Department of Education, well, what is their job? Well, setting standards and putting limits and providing funds and overseeing grant programs. So maybe organizing and implementing policies related to education. Department of Energy, they're identifying safety levels and new technological developments and giving grants to researchers. So organizing and implementing policy related to energy. So the idea or the purpose of the cabinet level departments is basically because the president can't do it all, right? I think somebody maybe said division of labor earlier. The idea being the president can't cover all of those agencies, and so we create cabinet level offices, we create these departments who then they can be focused, they can become the expert on this policy level, and then the president simply oversees the secretaries, right? The president oversees these leaders, and we can now sort of divide and conquer all of those many tasks related to government. Do members of cabinet, do they have to have the approval of the Senate when they're appointed? Yes, they do. And can they be fired by the president? Yes, they can be fired by the president at any time. Of course, their replacement has to be confirmed by the Senate, but they can be fired. This is just a look at the organizational chart of the Department of Justice. This is actually only part of the chart. It was wider than I could fit on the screen and still be able to read it. But just to look at this particular section, you can see that under the DOJ, there's the Bureau of Prisons, INS, the DEA, the FBI, the Civil Rights Division, like there's all kinds of elements of the Department of Justice. So each of these departments has lots of stuff underneath it. And their purpose is to organize all the policies related to their particular area. Okay, so the next one down the list is the Executive Office of the President. This was created by Franklin Roosevelt in 1939, and basically Roosevelt argued that the government had gotten so big, there was so much going on, that it was more than the cabinet secretaries could do on their own, that the issues facing the country, this is the Great Depression, the World War II, all this business, were too big. The cabinet secretaries were busy doing their own thing. He needed more help. So why did he have to talk to Congress? Well, it's not a new department. They had to create a new agency, but why did Congress have to create it? The president can do whatever, invite whoever he wants to into his office. But they need money, right? They need funding. And so to get funding, to get appropriations, to be able to hire staff workers, secretaries, researchers, whatever, they had to have a congressional, like an act of Congress. So they established the Executive Office of the President, and the purpose of the Executive Office of the President is to provide policy advice or proposals for the President. They perform a public function, right? And this is important to remember because you're going to get them mixed up. Well, historically, students get them mixed up with the White House staff. And the difference is the Executive Office of the President provides policy advice or proposals to the president. And for that reason, appointees to the Executive Office of the President have to be confirmed by the Senate. They don't just serve the president, they serve the public in some way. They're providing information that is important for all of us as a country by providing that public policy proposal or public policy advice. So they have to be confirmed, but of course they can be fired. Some examples you can see up here. The OMB, the Office of Management and the Budget, their job is to help figure out how much money we're going to need to do what the president wants to do. The National Security Council, the Council of Economic Advisors. I might be mistaken, but I think it's the Economic Advisor Council that President Trump wants to appoint his son-in-law to. One of those. It's one of the members of the EOP. Anyway, but then there's the White House staff, which has existed from the time of George Washington. It is considered part of the bureaucracy because it was created by Congress and is run by the president, right? Congress creates a budget for the White House staff. They can hire, they buy all their, food and flowers and pretty Christmas decorations and whatever else it is. Like, all of that comes through the White House staff, like congressional appropriation. But the White House staff serves the president alone, right? They are not providing policy initiatives. They are not doing public proposals. They serve the president alone. And so as a result, you put an asterisk here, this is important, the White House staff does not require Senate confirmation. The president can appoint anyone they want to, and of course can fire them as well. So you might go, well, that doesn't matter. They're like cooks and gardeners and maids. Well, yes, they are, but it's also, the White House staff includes the president's chief of staff, who might not be making political proposals, but is in charge of pretty much everything the president does. If the chief of staff doesn't want you to see the president, you'll never get to the president. If the chief of staff doesn't want your email to get through to the president, it's not going to get through. Chief of staff has a lot of power. The press secretary, the person in charge of communicating between the office of the president and the public or the press itself, is part of the White House staff. And again, they do not require congressional approval. He's a senior advisor. The chief of staff has been appointed as Reince Priebus. So the cabinet are those executive level offices. So I are the executive departments. It's labeled here as cabinet level departments. Okay, so then let's talk about regulatory commissions. These are those IRCs we talked about. Remember when we talked about the president, we talked about how the president can't fire. Everybody doesn't have complete control. So here are those independent regulatory commissions. The purpose or the job of the independent regulatory commissions is to protect the people, right? They're enacting policies, but they're protecting the people. They're serving us, not directly the president. So as a result, the president does need congressional approval, a Senate confirmation for these appointees. But again, here's another anomaly. He cannot fire them. Whoever gets placed as the head of the EPA cannot be fired. They can be impeached if they commit crimes, but cannot be fired. They just serve out a term. They have fixed term limits for each of these offices. And you can see some examples there. The easiest ones to remember are like the FDA, the EPA, and the FCC. That would be Securities and Exchange Commission, not Southeastern Conference or whatever. It's not football. And so you know what they do, right? The SEC is all about regulating stocks and bonds. The EPA is all about protecting the environment. The FDA is all about regulating foods, additives, and of course pharmaceuticals. So remember, each of these is trying to protect the public. They also, this is another thing that's important, they have the power to punish. So if the EPA sets limits on pollution, and you own a factory and you are exceeding those limits, they don't have to call in a report to the FBI and try to get you, prosecuted for some crime. They can just fine you right there. They have regulatory authority. You have broken our violation. Here's our evidence. Your fine is this. Now, of course, you can appeal it. There's obviously an appeals process. They could go through the courts. But they have the authority to fine you in and of themselves. So sometimes people get nervous. Well, why can't the independent regulatory agency chiefs be fired? What if they're bad? But the greater fear, apparently, is that if they do things that are unpopular, if Congress creates a law that says we've got to cut pollution by X amount, the EPA is in charge of making sure that happens. Nobody's going to like the EPA telling you to stop polluting or fining you if you go over. They're not going to like it if prices raise because of these regulations. And so the idea is that when these agencies are given control or the desire to protect the people, we don't want them to worry about public pressure. They literally can't be removed unless they commit crimes. But their term ends. Their terms are short. The term of the president. Okay, so then we get to independent agencies, sometimes called independent commissions. One of the things I want you to write in that box that says details about the job is that these are apolitical. That means not political. So the independent agencies are not designed to be about politics. So like the EPA, for example, their ability to fine, whether or not we should be regulating the environment, what the approach is, that's up for debate, right? Each president might have a different approach to what the EPA should be doing. But the CIA, does anybody not want the CIA to get good intelligence and protect us from foreign threats? Sounds like a pretty universal goal, right? The CIA is one of those, we don't really intend, the CIA chief often stays on through presidencies, right? So one president Republican, one president Democrat, nobody fires the CIA chief, right? Unless they're getting older or they think that we need to go in a direction. The CIA chief is typically, they last the whole time. NASA, the funding of NASA can be a little bit political, but the idea of NASA and research and scientific development and innovation, those are things that we pretty much all agree to, and we go on. So we're